Hello everybody, how's it going today? Glowplasma231 here, back in today to talk about weekly Shonen Jump, issue number 42 of 2023. And hey, this week in Shonen Jump, we got a few interesting things happen. We actually don't have anything ending, or at least what I'm reading. I'm pretty sure there was a series that ended this week, but it's not anything I'm reading, so that's pretty cool. But we also got a new series starting with Kagurabachi, chapter number 1 this week. And if you've just existed on the internet any time during time when this issue came out and now, and I'm recording this video, which is about 4 months late. Hey, we don't talk about that much. I'm gonna get caught up slowly by surely, right? But slowly but surely, however you say that saying. But Kagurabachi has been memed on, and hey, this is where the meme all started, the first chapter of the series. So we're going to talk about that about halfway through the video. If you want to just go and skip to that section now, I got a little bit of a timestamp down in the description, and you can see it on the video, but I'd recommend you don't skip, because I think I got some good stuff going on here. And yeah, so this week I think we got 12 series total to talk about, which is pretty nice, pretty much the lineup of almost everything that I am talking about, except for Elusive Samurai, but that should be back into runnings next week. But yeah, I mean, this issue has Kagurabachi on the front of it, and without further ado, I don't have too much else to say, so I'd say let's just go and hop right into it with My Hero Academia, chapter number 400. I mean, this is a milestone for My Hero. A total of 400 chapters. I mean, that's pretty cool, but off with Aoyama being able to see Hagakure, as we see that what happened with Hagakure is that everybody can see her now because pretty much Aoyama's light was so strong, and it evolved, and it made Hagakure visible, and not being the invisible girl anymore. And oh my goodness, would you believe that? That is insane. I mean, it's just crazy, right? But it's a pretty cool note of just saying how Aoyama's quirk has evolved so much that it can now actually bug out the invisibility quirk that Hagakure has. Because pretty much how it's explained is that pretty much so much light force was shot at Hagakure that her quirk wasn't able to function, and that's because all of the naval laser power is just too strong, right? At the same time, of course, All Might fired the big laser down on All for One in the city as they were fighting. But he isn't dead yet, as we see All Might also use a few other of the quirks of various people. He uses earphone jack, and he also uses an armor type quirk thing. He calls it morphing armor cheat, which is then evolved into grape juice, which of course is mean that is it's sort of like little bomb balls that go and hit more of All for One. And All Might even makes a note of, hey, I need to keep doing this while my euphoria is still overriding the pain. So pretty cool to All Might showing what he's made of. As we continue, we suddenly cut to some other place in some other country as a grandma and her very young son or not young son, but a young kid also, and who I'm presuming is like a grandma or somebody, are watching TV, and they're watching All Might fight on a big screen, and the kid's just like, hey, who's the guy in that skinny black armor? And the lady's just like, hey, I don't know much about all of them heroes out there, and the kid's just like, hey, well, what happens if he wins or loses, right? And the lady says that, like, hey, that's all going on in some far-off land. Whoever wins doesn't have too much to do with us, right? And the kid looks, but he claps his hands together and sort of just, I guess, watches intently as the battle continues, right? We then see that the laser that All Might fired has finally ceased, and coming out from the rubble is a very, very young All for One. His regeneration, his regression hasn't stopped yet, but he's still regressing more. He's probably about the age of a small child now, maybe 3 to 4 years old, maybe even 5, like not that old yet. He makes a note of, like, hey, as I said, certain tools just can't surpass their own limits, right? But the other important thing to note is that All Might says, like, hey, his body is glowing, right? Why does he have a glowing body? Which, of course, would sort of have to do with the fact that, oh man, didn't the first baby whose quirk was ever discovered was glowing, right? I mean, that's a big deal. But as All for One goes to try to attack All Might, he starts to have a growth come out of the back of his back to attack All Might and pierce him. But as it starts to grow, all of a sudden it stops. And he makes the note of, like, I can't move, what's going on here? Like, I can't do anything, I'm just stuck, right? As all of a sudden, somebody appears behind All Might. And he is here, and he just says, all bleed red. as we see that it is Stain, who has a little piece of slate and his tongue has licked it, and it had All For One's blood on it, and using his blood quirk, of course, All For One has been stopped in his tracks, giving All Might the chance to go and take him out. As much as I may not sound too enthusiastic about this chapter, this is absolutely awesome. I just love Stain, and of course, we saw him a little bit whenever it came to the prison breakouts, or we didn't see much of him. We saw a tiny bit about him, and then seeing him again almost, I think his initial arc was about 60 chapters in, so seeing him all this time later, about 300 chapters, it's just awesome to see him again. Of course, he's helping out the one person he believes is a true hero in All Might, and that's just a really awesome moment I don't think you can go wrong with at all. Next up is One Piece, chapter number 1092. We're getting very high up there, and this chapter is titled Kuma the Tyrant's Holy Land Rampage. We start off with a slight color page with Jinbei on it, right? The whole suggestion is Jinbei being smushed by giant cuddly remoras. So, pretty cool. I like Jinbei. Interesting enough, right? But we start off this chapter at Sacred Mary Jo on top of the Red Line, as we see that Tyrant Bartholomew Kuma, who of course is the pacifista robot, is standing up, and everybody's like, oh my gosh, he finally climbed to the top. Like, all the soldiers get on him at once, and they're like, oh, we can't, and all the soldiers are like, oh man, we can't, he's just unstoppable, as he's just up there, and we see that Kuma is like breathing heavily, and all of his gears are like going around, and everybody's like, oh man, he's hell-bent on reaching his destination no matter what it is. And we see that Kuma uses an Ursa Shock move to pretty much blast out everybody around him, as we see that somebody comes up to deal with him, and this is none other than Akainu, of course, or Red Dog, whatever you want to call him. And Akainu is here, and he's just like, hey, what do you think you're doing? He's like, first the revolutionaries the other day, and now this. You must answer for this historic destruction, Kuma. As we see the two of them sort of start to get into a little bit of a tussle, as they sort of just keep on talking back and forth. And it's a really big note of like, hey, this has never happened before. Sacred Mary Jo's food supply is just crapped out right now, and that so many people have been injured due to Kuma. And we see a bunch of celestial dragons looking on just like, hey, we need to put Kuma to death right now. And Akainu's just like, hey, Kuma, if we can't maintain control of you, then you're just a dead man already, so we've got no problem in killing you. And he goes up and uses one of his Hellhound moves. But we see that Kuma just doesn't stop there and just keeps running away, and all of a sudden, as he's running, he suddenly whips using his Paw fruit and disappears, right? And Akainu just sort of makes the note of like, hey, he's just a mere puppet with no mind or will left. We then cut back over to Egghead, where all of the battle is still going on. We see Luffy, who is in Gear 4, I think, what's that, Snake Man or Tank Man or whatever, I forget what it's called, is fighting off or dueling with Kizaru. The two of them are going back and forth, and we see that Kizaru's just like, hey, I don't actually want to kill Luffy, but I just want to incapacitate him here soon enough, because he is being such a bit, or no, he's not saying that. Luffy asked him, hey, why do you want to kill Vegapunk so much? And Kizaru says that he doesn't want to kill him, but he's known Vegapunk for a long time. But the whole thing is his government job is sort of requiring him to do it. So as he goes there, he gets ready to fire one of his light beam weapons out, and oh, he goes to attack, but oh, look at that, he knocks out the ship that the Vega Force 1 is carrying. So, oh no, that's a big deal. We see that a bunch of the Vegapunks and different other people are just like talking around, and this is a little chapter with a lot of dialogue going on. We also see Bonnie's here, but as Bonnie's trying to go help out people, Kizaru comes over and is just like, hey, we can't do anything. Bonnie also then tries to attack Kizaru, but Kizaru sort of warps out of his Logia so he can't get touched. So yeah, they just keep fighting, and all of a sudden we cut over to Vegapunk, who is in the Tower Labo phase, as he's there and he's like, alright, Arika, the code is cracked, and he's just like, in your face, York, we don't have to deal with that anymore. And York's just like, what, damn it, no, what are you talking about, you stupid geniuses? They just keep on talking, but we eventually see that Kizaru walks up to saying like, hey, Vegapunk, your escape plan is a failure. He's like, I've blown your so-called giant robot of dreams to very big smithereens, as he walks up and he is right in front of Vegapunk, And they point to him like, Kizaru, when did you get in here, right? But Kizaru's just like, hey, please understand, this is very difficult for me too. I'd rather not draw it out. But as he goes and he gets ready to go and do something to Vegapunk, we see Luffy, who's now in Gear 5th, come up, and he just grabs Kizaru in his hand, and he's just like, whew, that was a bit spicy, as he just gets up there, and yeah, everybody's just freaking out, just like, holy crap, it's Luffy, and he's grabbing an admiral, right? And I do like Kizaru's expression of, oh, here, this is what it is. This is that thing you do now, Luffy, right? And Luffy's just like, hey, thanks for knocking me all the way down, jerk. He's like, I almost thought I was going to die. Be going through all of that barrier twice and everything, right? But at the very end of the chapter, the big sort of reveal is a giant robot in the bottom of Egghead has finally turned on, and we see its eyes are now illuminated. Probably because of, yeah, Luffy's using Gear 5th, the power of the Sun God Nika and all of that. So, yeah, pretty cool right there. As with many One Piece chapters, this is really convoluted, and it will pay off in due time. I mean, I know it will, and like I said, we're here about 4 months later, and there has been a massive flashback going on in One Piece, and we have figured out pretty much what most of this chapter means in a way, but yeah, it's just a lot to talk about, and One Piece is a very complicated series through and through, so... But with that, we're going to get on to a chapter which, while it isn't as complicated, still has a lot of good stuff going on in it, and that is Undead Unluck, chapter number 175. This chapter is simply titled RIP, or R.I.P., but contrary to some other chapters which have been called RIP, but like R.I.P., this one's actually just like RIP, like the word RIP. We also have a cool color page of a older Dr. Rip with a scalpel in his hand, standing there and putting his hand on a young Rip. So, pretty cool color page, and the first color page we're going to be talking about today. Last time Fuko had showed up to explain to Rip the situation as Rip was wheeling down a gurney with Layla in it, who of course started coughing up blood and getting into a very unstable condition after last chapter. But as Suma explains, she's just like, hey, Uma's sick is the cause, and she's like, you must use your unrepair to beat sickness and heal everyone, right? And also, of course, Latla's standing there next to Fuko, and Latla's just like, hey, listen, Rip, this is what's going on. But all of a sudden, Rip doesn't care. He and the other nurse with him sort of rush down the other way, and Layla's just like, hey, Rip, this girl is, right? But Rip's just like, hey, can't you see what's going on now? We will talk later. We'll get all of this figured out, right? And he's like, the lives in front of me take top priority right now. No exceptions. And he also says that if everyone dies, this is all over, and saving lives is my job. As we eventually cut over to see that Layla is on the surgery table and that her heart rate is failing, and a bunch of bad stuff's going on as Rip walks over getting ready to do his surgery, right? But we also see that a few of these doctors are just looking on in what Rip is doing with, like, extreme caution. Like, Rip, hey, you're not even marking off these surfaces. Like, hey, you're just being way too fast, right? But Rip is just like, hey, I'm going to need your guys' help. I only have 2 arms, and I need 2 more, so follow my lead. As everybody's just like, oh my gosh, Rip is so fast, and not even his assistants can, like, hold up. Like, this is just crazy. Like, he's just going too fast here. As we see it, the surgery is all finished, and everybody's just freaking out, just like, oh my gosh, this is amazing, right? Like, this is crazy. But Rip says that he only bought her some time, that at her current stamina level, making her real heart surgery seems very dangerous. So as all of this is going on, Layla finally wakes up and she just says like, hey, Rip, help the others, I'll be fine, right? And one of the doctors is just like, hey, why didn't you guys sedate her? I mean, she just had massive surgery, right? But everybody's just freaking out like, well, I did put it in, but how is she conscious already, right? But Layla's just sitting there and she's just telling Rip like, hey, Rip, you are a doctor, and when you're here, even if you're not my lover or a personal hero, Rip, you are just everybody's hero, right? As Rip sort of takes knowledge of this, and he's just like, yes, I will save everybody. So he goes over to all of his doctor assistants and is just like, hey, everybody, take care of other patients, but which patient requires the most urgent care right now? Who can I work on immediately, right? We see it now as one of the younger girls from last chapter, as we see that she's in a very bad situation, and she's just like, hey, I'm so sorry, and she's just like crying, but Rip's like, hey, it's all okay. And he's like, what are you crying for? You're all good now, right? But she's like, I couldn't eat food, but I still took your candy. I was a very bad girl, right? And she just makes a note of, hey, so God got angry and punished me, right? And at this point, Rip just says, like, hey, listen up to this. Like, there are no bad children in this hospital. Every single one of you is trying your very hardest to make do with the painful homework we've been giving you. And he says, which is, why, if there's a God in this world who makes such good kids suffer, then I'd fillet up that jerk good. Which, of course, is a big mile to the world of Undead Unluck with, yeah, God's a bad guy, right? He's the one who implemented all these rules, making a bunch of people's lives a living hell in a way, right? But he just says, like, after all, they can't call me a hero, as he performs the surgery on this girl, right? We now cut over to Fuko and Latla, who are just going around, and Latla's like, hey, do you mean all of this is Sick doing? Like, this is a bunch of stuff going on here. And Fuko's just like, yeah, it's likely 6 juniors and, or more of its children that are causing this, right? Because, of course, I'm guessing Layla or Latla doesn't know everything about Umas yet, or UMAs, whatever you want to call them. So as they're walking around, Fuko also says, like, hey, they're probably spraying sickness to people to turn into nutrients, right? And, like, once juniors finish delivering the nutrients to the main body, they'll start impacting entire nations, not just hospitals. And Lotla's like, hey, there's something that dangerous here, and yet we're just, like, running around, and you're using my fortune telling to try to find it, right? And Fuko says, or, yeah, I mean, that's what we're doing. Like, is this a spot? As she opens up a room, and they look around, and there are just so many sick people in this room, and it just doesn't look too out of the ordinary, right? As, like, everybody's doing bad, but there's no visible trace there. And Fuko is just like, oh man, don't tell me it's an invisible UMA, as they're all sort of just walking around, but all of a sudden something jumps over by Latla, or Fuko jumps off next to Latla, and goes and kicks one of the juniors in the face, right? As Layla's like, oh my gosh, there's something here, like, that's crazy. But as Fuko kicks this Uma in half, we see that it, while it splits in two, it grows 2 new parts, and each of those 2 parts multiplied into a different thing, right? So Fuko's like, oh man, yeah, this is bad. It multiplied. It's attacking so haphazardly that it's being able to split itself on a whim, right? So as all these people, Fuko's just like, all right, then I need to take these things down with everything I have. So as she starts running around a hospital, we eventually cut back over to Rip, who has just finished the last very important surgery. So a lot of people are like, oh my gosh, Rip is so cool. They say he's got the chart of every patient in this hospital memorized. Like, this is just crazy. And they're all like, I thought, like, his nickname was just something crazy they slapped on him, but it was accurate after all. And they call him the Prince Des Patients, which, okay. But pretty much we see that Rip finished this off, and he did an amazing job, right? But he eventually sits down, sort of just taking a break for a second, and he thinks of Layla's words, like, Rip, you're everybody's hero. But Rip is sort of just freaking out, just like, but I haven't saved anybody yet. Like, I just kept them alive. I haven't fixed a single damn thing. It's like, if those symptoms were to reoccur in everyone, we'd be out of second chances to have, right? And he's just like, oh God, I just can't do this anymore. As Fuko eventually walks up to him, and she just says, like, hey, the next wave will be here soon. And she just says, a handful of juniors were supposed to give nutritions to the mother sick. The next time patient systems progresses, it'll be exponentially worse, right? And Rip's just like, oh, hey, you're that girl from earlier. And I mean, what are you talking about? Monsters. As we see that Fuko also has, like, a little bag with all of these juniors in it. And, pretty much he just says, like, hey, or Fuko then says, like, hey, you're able to keep the damage in check this time around thanks to everything you did, Rip, but we won't be so lucky next time. And she just says, like, hey, you must administer your unrepair ability against the cause of this harm, Umasik. Only you can eradicate it, right? As Fuko's just standing there, but Rip just walks up and grabs her good luck jacket and just sort of pulls her forward as he just says, so you're saying there's a way to save everyone? And he just says, tell me, nothing in this world takes precedence over life. Nothing. As he's pretty much just saying, like, hey, whatever this is, even if I have to lose my ability to be a doctor, please tell me what I can do to save all of the people in this hospital. How can I save a life? Which is just a really awesome moment seeing it. And yeah, We're going to go over to Ichinose Family Deadly Sins, chapter 41 next. Of course, last chapter there was the whole big deal of, okay, Soda, we're going to be going home back to Tokyo to see the whole Ichinose family back together, right? We start off this chapter with a flashback in a way, as we pretty much just see, like, Shiori just saying, like, hey, there's something wrong at home, none of this is normal. After that car accident, I started having that dream, and nobody's been able to determine what happened to the grandma and anything else, as we just see everybody's freaking out. Of course, there's that moment last time whenever the mother of the family threw down the entire desk, and it had sort of was the main reason why Tsubasa ran away, right? And we see that Tsubasa is thinking about this as everybody's on the train back home. We see that Soda's standing there beside him, and Soda makes sort of a little note of like, hey, I got some ice cream, do you want some? And Tsubasa's like, yeah, I'll take it. Soda and Tsubasa just sort of talk like, hey, let's just forget about this whole thing. There's no need to be there. And Tsubasa's like, hey, you don't come if it's just too much for you, right? But Soda's like, hey, but I can't let my little brother go all the way that way himself, right? But Tsubasa eventually just says, like, hey, everybody's not exactly fighting, but ever since I woke up, they've just been off. And he says, we had a very big blowout before I left, right? But Tsubasa's like, then how is going home going to help any of this at all, right? But Tsubasa's like, all right, Soda, we're here to transfer now. Let's get going. So as they just continue, Soda just continues saying, like, hey, listen, Tsubasa, even if we go home, we can't fix everything, right? He's like, nobody can. But Tsubasa just says, like, hey, right now it doesn't matter. I just want everybody to see and try to understand things. You don't need to fix. We need to come to an understanding. As Soda's just like, or Tsubasa just continues just saying, like, hey, like, what happened to our family after that accident, what everybody's thinking, what that dream is, like, we need to understand what's going on here. And he says, I'll be fine, he says sort of like, hey, I'll be fine, like, you took on a great role playing the role of a dad super seriously in Fuku, right? But as they just keep talking, they eventually get into a little bit of a banter behind that, and they actually start to smile and look a different way as they eventually get close to Tokyo. And when Soda finally asks, like, Tsubasa, you said that Grandma and Grandpa are both comatose, right? But he's like, are they in a really bad way? And Tsubasa's like, yeah, when I woke up, Grandpa was already. But Soda sort of just cuts him off there, just saying, like, yeah, I'm sure. As all of a sudden, Tsubasa's drinking his drink and just says, hey, this is definitely sweet. This is definitely different than what I'm used to. As all of a sudden, they just continue talking about a dream, as Tsubasa just says, like, hey, it was so sudden with Grandma, it took me completely by surprise. As Sota's just like, huh, what are you talking about? As Tsubasa says, like, it wasn't a disease or anything, and we have no idea what actually caused it. As he just says, like, since I left for Fuki right after, I actually don't know how she's doing. As eventually we see that Tsubasa reaches in his pocket and pulls out a key, and he remembers that this is the key to the grandfather's room, and he sort of just takes a look as we eventually see that they are all in front of the house, and Tsubasa's like, oh my gosh, it's been so long, I'm actually so nervous now, as he goes up and rings the doorbell, but somebody else opens it, not his family. And Tsubasa's like, hey, well, this is my house, and he's just like, but what's going on here? If this is a different lady, and the lady's just like, huh, nobody named Ichinose lives here. And he looks outside, and the name on the house is Yamaguchi, so definitely very different. As all of a sudden, we cut to black, as Tsubasa finally wakes up, and we see that he is in a hospital bed with all 6 people surrounding him looking down at him. And Tsubasa is just like, what's going on here? As the entire family supposedly has amnesia again. And Tsubasa is just freaking out. He's just like, what? This is a dream. He's like, the entire family with amnesia? That's impossible. But he's like, even Sota's here this time. It's not just the 6 of us. There are 7 in total. He's like, why am I having this dream again? What's going on? As we get an image of the dad of the family holding a bottle of water, to tea or whatever, to drink this boss was sipping earlier. And we see 6 of the members of the family all laying down on the ground. We see Soda Tsubasa, Shiori, the 2 grandparents, and the mother all laying down at the same time. So, oh no, the plot continues, the plot thickens, more twists and turns. What's going on here? We'll find out next time on the Ichinose Family's Deadly Sins. Bum ba dum ba dum bum. And next we have Martial Master Asumi, chapter number 13. This chapter is titled Finisher. Of course, last time we saw that Nito had entered the dropout ring with, of course, Yoshitoki there as his second, and he had been introduced as the younger brother of Kozlo. And that's where we start off this chapter with a lot of people at Kozlo's gym all standing around and they're just like, oh, hey Kozlo, let's watch this on the big screen, right? At this point we get introduced to all of the other challengers. There are 8 of them in total. And we get introduced to him as sort of, since our very first tournament, he's been the Dropout's poster boy. You all know his name, Kyobe Yakushima. And then we get the next one. Next up, this badass single-handedly took over the roughest school in the district, the modern-day gangster, Kinjo Sakura. And then, now on, the sexy assassin from the underground host club Dazzle. Your number 1 pick, Murito, is ready to melt your heart. Then we see next one is that swinging those arms like a pair of helicopter blades, you know him and love him, Tokichi's Wrecking Ball, Hikori Doi. Of course, this is a character we've known the series for. That's pretty cool to see. We see another one saying, like, this challenger's rhymes won't be the only thing to lay you out. It's a DJ Shabazo. Pretty fun. And then straight from Junival Hall, this kid's a total junkie for fighting, Hatsuki Taro. And then we have my own personal favorite dark horse, the mysterious masked fighter Kid Tiger. As we see, there's this guy in a tiger mask here, so that's pretty fun. And then the final introduction is just saying, like, hey, and finally, one half the famous sibling brawl that has already generated 2 million views, the little brother of the Dropout's legendary rising star Kozlo, Nito Asumi, right? As one of my favorite just parts of this chapter is Nito just thinking, oh god, it's gotten to 2 million views already, like, this isn't good, right? But yeah, we see that Nito's here, age 16, 173 centimeters, and 63 kilograms, so... What is 63 kilograms in pounds? I'm going to look that up. 63 kilograms to pounds. That's 138 pounds. Pretty neat. So I'm guessing 70 kilograms since that's what their number was. Oh, nope. Look at that. Yeah, it's about 150 pounds that all these people are under. So that's pretty neat. We see there's a bunch of banter going on as we see that Yuya and Now are both watching this fight, and as everything is going on, we see that Yuya's like, man, I would have loved to be at this, to watch this match live, but I just got the chills from doing it, and Now also says, like, how she wanted to be there too. But Yuya's just like, hey, do you think Nito can pull this off now? But Now just says, like, honestly, when it comes to Nito, I just can't make a prediction. As we see that she thinks, he's like, up till now I've been trying to teach him about the fun aspects of MMA, the beauty of competition, so he would fall in love with it. But we cut over back to the Dropout, where we see a bunch of people are standing there, all saying like, oh hey, Murito, do your best. So we see this was the host club guy, Murito Genja, as we see that he is Nito's first guy that he's going to be fighting in round 1. Murito sort of just talks down to you a little bit, just saying like, oh hey, you're Kozlo's baby brother, well, leave it to me to find a diamond in the rough. This is just destiny, right? It's like, maybe I'll get a call about it from, after my shining victory tonight, right? So as all of this is going on, yeah, Nito's in the ring, getting ready to fight. Yoshitoki gives him a little bit of a pep-up speech, right? But all of a sudden, Nito just sort of starts hopping up in the air. He's just like, man, I'm just so scared. But on the outside, he's just jumping, saying, I'm not afraid. As we see that Hiroki is also in the audience, and he just says, like, hey, didn't he do the same thing before he started with Kazuro whenever he fought me too? Like, is this just normally what he does? At this point, we also cut back over to Nito's house, where we see that his sister's just calling everybody over, all his younger siblings, to like, hey, I could use your guys' help with dinner, right? But all of the people are just like, hey, no, not now. Nito's battle is beginning to start. We all see that his grandfather is looking in. And as the bell chimes to start to fight, Nito gets up, he dashes into the ring, right towards, I forgot his name, what is his name? Mureto. And he just runs in, and everybody's like, what's going on here? Mureto's like, oh, is he going to hit me with a flying knee? Was it the one that I saw in this video, right? Hiroki also looks, and he's just like, oh, it's what he used on me, which was the flying cross arm lock. But we see that Nito sort of suddenly ducks down and acts like it's about to be a tackle, as there's a bunch of just like MMA stuff going on here. But Nito sort of persists with this, just thinks like, hey, now was the one who came up with this for me, as he just thinks like, hey, my opponent is about as tall as Okube was. And he's like, after a feint, his head will lower just enough to, as he says, I know the move this power holds. If it lands, it will be a finisher. As he jumps up, and sure enough, he puts a flying knee into Mureto's face. Mureto falls to the ground, and Nito's just like, okay, go, I'm in. He's like, don't let up, keep up the pressure, as he's like, go, go, go. And he just like starts to wail on Mureto, sort of getting his down, and all of a sudden the referee is the correct term, sort of comes in and butts Nito out of the way, just like yelling, hey, you can stop now. And Nito sort of freaks out like, oh, hey, I didn't break another dropout roll, did I? And he looks over to Yoshitoki, but Yoshitoki just looks up and gives Nito a thumbs up, right? And Nito's just like, oh, I did it then. As we get the announcer just saying like, hey, in round 1, in just 6 seconds from the red corner, the winner by knockout is Nito Asumi. As we cut over to Kozlo, where he is with all the other members of his gym, and he's just screaming like, oh, hell yeah, look at that, Nito did it. He's like, in seconds, did you guys see that? And he's just like shaking around all of his friends, and he's just like, hey, I knew Nito had it in him. He's like, Nito can really do this. As we cut back over to the Nito family household, where the grandfather is looking on, and he just makes note of, he's like, if being afraid doesn't stop him from leaping, he's just like a rabbit, right? As we get the idea that Nito means 2 rabbits in Japanese, so that's pretty cool. And then all of the people that were supporting Mureto on his side of the ring are just like, hey ref, you called that way too fast, and he's like he can still fight. But Yoshitoki just says like, hey, is that what you guys think? I'd say you guys should have stopped it sooner. It's like, show some concern for the guy in your corner, right? As Yoshitoki again looks over to Nito, who's sort of standing there again with Fugakaware. At this point, we cut back over to the gym where Now and Yuta are watching on, and they're sort of just talking, and Now just says like, hey, Cosmos have known all along that Nito was one of us martial art people. As we sort of see what Nito's thinking during this, and he's just like, man, there's another reason I entered that I haven't revealed to the others, is he just thinks like, hey, I wanted to feel the taste of fighting again like that, and he's like, the one I had during those other fights is like, the pressure, the excitement, my heart's pounding out of my chest, and he's just like, I think I actually may like this. So let's go into the chapter. Really awesome moment where we just see Nito come up and take out this guy in flat out seconds, just showing his own growth. Hey guys, how's it going? Post-production Glowplasma231 here. I was going through and editing this video, and next up would normally be the Mamayuyu section, and to be honest with you, this wasn't a good section at all, so I'm going to spare all of you guys the about 10 minutes I talked about this chapter, so on to Kagurabachi next, but yeah, this section just wasn't good, and you guys don't want to hear, and I personally didn't like hearing it either, and it was my voice, so yeah, we're just skipping this section, and it should be in the recording next week, because I will talk about it better, and not as terribly as I did here. I mean, if you want to know what happened, just go read the chapter. I mean, I pretty much said what happened in the chapter very poorly, so yeah, that's it guys, back to the video. Next up is Kagurabachi, chapter number 1, and of course this is the big meme series, right? But we start off this chapter with, of course, the color page, and some narration just breaking down some information, just saying that forging also known as tannerin, is an important process to making Japanese swords. More information just going like, hey, tamagane is steel made from iron sand. It is hammered thin, folded, then hammered again to strengthen itself and establish the right amount of carbon content. Through tannerin and several other highly skilled processes, the lump of steel is transformed into a beautiful, strong katana. As we open up on chapter number 1, titled Mission, as we get a color page of our main character, him cutting down a bunch of guys with a sword or with a katana, so very interesting there. But it does also look like his katana is very small. We eventually start off the chapter with a little bit of thoughts as we see that Chiro here is with his dad, and they're sort of going back and forth, and we just get the imagery of that. Oh, look at that. Chihiro's dad is a very interesting guy, right? Rokuhira Swordsmith, that is their family name. So as they're just going around, Chiro just looks at his dad and is like, hey, what's up with him today? As we see them in the forge, and they are all forging some iron and steel, as Chiro just thinks like, hey, my dad's name is Kunishige Rokuhira. He's the most famous swordsmith in the land. He makes a special katana with his own unique method, and I train with him rigorously every day. And he looks down, and as we're forging, he says, right now my dad's in his serious mode, and it is way different than his usual self. As we see later that day when they're not actually forging swords, they're inside their house, and we see that, what's his first name? Kunishige? Yeah, Kunishige is there looking at a bowl of fish. And Chihiro's like, oh, hey, Dad, breakfast is ready. And he's just like, you were just listening to your pet fish now, huh? And he's like, normally people talk, not the fish, right? And his dad's like, oops, my bad, let's sit down and eat. And as they're sitting, Chihiro's like, so did the goldfish even say anything? But his dad's just like, hey, more than anything, they just want to dedicate themselves to learning, right? As he sort of just, we get an image of them just sitting there and talking. We then cut over to them making swords again, and his serious father. And Chihiro just thinks, like, come to think of it, my dad's the one who brought all of those little fish here. As we get some more information of, like, his dad walking into the room, like, hey, breakfast is ready, Shuriho. Chiro, and he's like doing some homework or something, and he also brings in some fresh goldfish, right? And Chihiro's is like, why'd you get more goldfish? But as they talk, he's like, you don't even take care of them, it's just gonna be my job in the long run. But his dad is just like, hey, but the guy at the goldfish shop said that goldfish are really lucky, and Chihiro's is like, and you really believe all of that. But we see that his father said that the red one attracts good fortune, and the black wards off evil, and the 3-colored one is actually just pretty cool. So that's really all there is to it. And Chihiro's like, oh man, you do not say all that, like, come on, why are you just thinking this? As we eventually just get more narration from Chihiro, just going like, when my dad made a face like, oh, that's a neat idea, I decided to take care of all of those goldfish that day. And he's just like, it's just one more responsibility for me, and like, oh man, my dad's really a handful. We then cut back to all of them forging more swords, and while that's going on, we see some man start walking up some steps outside of the Kunishige Rokuhira shop where they are actively forging swords. Inside, Kunishige's is like, hey Chihiro, do you want to stop for some lunch soon? And he also takes a little bit of a note of like, oh hey Chihiro, you're getting very big and strong there. It's like, your arms may be bigger than mine someday. But as all of that comes in, a guy walks in, he's like, man, I brought some souvenirs. He's like, man, I'm beat. And they sort of just go in a little bit of banter, and we see that this guy is named Mr. Shiba. As Chihiro explained, just saying like, Mr. Shiba is an old friend of my dad's who often stops by sometimes, right? As we see that they're all interacting with the goldfish, and Shiba's just talking to Chihiro, just saying like, hey, you sure grew up a whole lot, Chihiro. And he's like, well, I'm still bigger, too bad. And it's just some more banter. But eventually, Shiba just says like, hey, your dad was 15 years ago in the Saite War. He's like, he was more famous than the guys like me who actually fought in the battlefield, right? He's just like, no exaggeration to say that the epic swordsman, that he ended the war back there. He's like, don't forget that your dad has saved a lot of people in his life. He's like a hero, right? And Chihiro's is like, yeah, I've actually heard that a lot of times, right? And they just start to talk, and Shiba's eventually just like, hey, you're a really hard worker, aren't you, Chihiro? And he's like, I'm sure you'll be like your old man someday. And they just talk a little bit more, and eventually they just start bantering, and we see that Shiba ends up leaving. And his dad looks down at Chihiro and just like, hey, you're going to be 15 real soon, and if you want to be a real swordsmith, well, it's about time I show you the stuff that ain't so all bright and shiny, right? And as his dad's doing this, Chihiro's like, yeah, well, let's do it then, right? And his dad sort of looks down, but Chihiro's like, hey, just so you know, like, I'm not joking about becoming a swordsmith. He's like, I'm serious. I really want to follow in your footsteps. So his father's just like, okay, yeah, I know. Let's do it. As they walk into a room in their house, and there's a sword sitting there on a pedestal, right? And he says, so Chihiro, there's a few of these swords stored in the basement. He says, mostly katana I made before you were actually born. And Chihiro just says, like, were they katana used in a war? And Kunishige says, yes, they very much were. He says that katana have always saved lives and slashed open new eras. But he says, but I'm sure you also know that katanas are still swords for killing people. As he has one of those bamboo stand things in his room, and he takes the sword down and slashes it clean open. As he just says that we, as swordsmen, are complicit in the depths that these swords cause. And he says, if they were to ever to fall into the hands of evil, these swords could kill many good people. And he says, as swordsmiths, we always have to keep that in mind. And he says, a katana should be wielded by those dedicated to vanquishing evil and protecting the weak. But he says, and that goes for us swordsmiths too. And he says, we need to have principles and accountability. And he then turns to Chihiro and says, the day you sell your first katana, and when you hand someone a katana, those two things will... And Kunishige just says, like, one day you, Chihiro, will sell your first katana. And when you hand someone a katana, those two things will weigh heavily on your mind and fall into your shoulders. And he says, Chihiro, can you truly take care of that burden? But Chihiro sort of just looks up at his father and says, yes, I am committed to taking it on. And Kunishige just says, okay, that sounds good. Well, let's get back to work. And he says, if that's how you feel, all that's left is just for me to believe in you. As we then see it, they start to walk into the shop, and Chihiro just gets more narration, just thinking, that's my dad, as he looks at his back as he's walking into the shop. And Chihiro then makes a little bit of a joke of like, hey, you can clean up the mess you made by slicing that thing clean open. And Kunishige is like, oops, I'm so sorry. A little bit of comedic just to show that while his father's a really serious person, he also sort of has a bit more of a heart to him than you would give him credit for. We then cut to the center of a Tokyo / area, and we see that this is 36 months later, a full about 3 years and about 2 months after that moment, as we see that there are like a bunch of mafia boss guys standing around, and pretty much this one leader ordered one dude to slice open another one with a katana, right? And they sort of just talk a little bit, as eventually this boss is like, hey, you guys are a bunch of jokers. Every time I see you, like, you guys just, like, they just piss me off. And we see that the guy they're trying to kill is a part of a movement rebelling against this group. And pretty much the guys is like, hey, before you guys came here, the Krumi Rats, this was a very peaceful city. It's like, you guys are starting violence, like, you guys are bad, you guys are the jokers. And as all of this is going on, some guys just punches him, right? And this kid says, like, hey, just let me at that sorcerer up there. As all of a sudden we see a man who is like, oh, how fascinating. As we see this kid falls on the ground, and there's some magic type roots that come up from the ground and start to enstrain him, right? And this guy says, the guy who says how fascinating earlier, just says like, hey, Mr. Yakuza boss, I received your payment from the officials. He says, you know, I think bravery is often rooted in ignorance. And he's like, have you ever seen true sorcery? As we see this kid is starting to grow into a tree and is being enstrained. But this guy just looks down, he's like, hey kid, I asked you a question. This is your first time, isn't it, right? And the kid's just like, yeah. He's like, oh, I thought so. And he just continues more. So we pretty much just get the idea that this guy is a sorcerer who's a big deal. And he eventually then goes and just sets himself on fire to sort of just warp away as this kid's still trapped in a tree. We then cut and see Chihiro sitting on a train, of course. This is much older. He's sitting there with a sword beside him as we see Mr. Shiba from before walk up, and the two of them just sort of talk a little bit and sort of have a little bit of a comedic moment as we see Shiba is much more of a comedy-based guy, or Shiba is much more of like the cool-headed, like, come on, are you serious sort of dude. They sort of talk a little bit about it, and Shiba says, like, hey, you've got a pretty nasty scar on your face, Chiro. I mean, you could get that scar moved, right? And he says, like, it really stands out. Why don't you get rid of it or something? But Chiro just says, like, hey, every morning when I wash my face and look in a mirror, I see this scar and I remember that day. But he's like, even so, every day I start the morning with fresh hatred because of it, right? And Shiba sort of just makes a little bit of note of, like, hey, you've been living like this ever since then, and it is just going to completely break you if you keep doing this. We see they're in a train, and it eventually stops as they walk around. We see it like this is a very sort of older sort of timeline, as we see there's a bunch of, like, older cars and older trains sort of walking around. Chihiro talks to Shiba, and he's just like, hey, this city is ruled by the Korogumi Yakuza, and Chihiro just makes it like, hey, are those Yakuza connected to them? And Shiba's just like, hey, yeah, they are, but I honestly can't be sure, but we only have the single lead, right? And as they eventually turn the corner, they see hanging off of a bridge are four guys who are tied up and sort of just hanging off the bridge, all beaded and bloodied. And Chihiro just makes a note of, like, hey, these guys are colossal scumbags. They eventually walk around. We just see a bunch of other people just being nasty and just Yakuza guys. We see that Shiba takes one of them out by throwing a knife and cutting this guy's jugular. As he walks over, and everybody's just freaking out, but when we see Chihiro steps in and just offs all these guys in one shot. We eventually see the kid from earlier who got ensnared by a tree still sitting there, and the Yakuza boss from before just like, hey, nothing good will come of you just holding out. He's like, we'll just have to get your family involved unless you will tell us right now who your conspirators are. And as they're doing all of this, the kids just start to say, like, hey, okay, I'll tell you everything. But as this happens, somebody's apparently at the door. And as they go to open it, it is none other than Chihiro who comes in and tears off some limbs, cuts up some people. And Yakuza boss is just freaking out, like, hey, who are you? What are you doing here? Like, you don't need to be here. We eventually see Shiba outside, has rounded up all these thugs, and is just, like, sitting on them, just taking on them. And he just says to these guys, like, hey, that kid's the son of Kunishige Rokuhira. And he's like, you've heard of him. The master swordsmith, famous for his special technique nobody else can do. We then see Chihiro, who is standing in a doorway, and everybody's like, hey, what do you want out of all of this? But Chihiro's like, hey, I came to ask you guys something. He's like, and also, I can't allow slime like you to wield various katanas. As we see that he just grabs a katana, goes around, and pretty much just kills a lot of these guys. As we cut it back out to Shiba, who is saying, like, hey, Kunishige Rokuhira imbued his katana with sorcery. The katana he made were enchanted blades with special powers. As we see that inside the building, Chihiro is pulling out his sword and going for an attack, as he just says the words Inten. As he opens up his sword seems to have water coming off it, and we see two goldfish swimming around Chihiro as he wields his sword. We cut back outside to Shiba's narration, just saying, like, hey, the boy that katana wields was Kunishige Rokuhira's last, the one he gave his life to make. As we see that on the inside, Chihiro just says Inten Black, as he just goes through and he pretty much slices all of these guys open. Like, his sword is long-winded. He goes around, spirals in the air, and just creates a lot of havoc. He also uses an attack called Nishiki. And as all this happens, we cut to apparently sometime later, as we see that Shiba is smoking a cigarette, and he walks back inside, and he sees that Chihiro's standing inside with a bloody mess, and he's talking to the one Yakuza boss, and Chihiro's just saying, like, hey, tell us what you know about the Hashaku. He says, the group of sorcerers that is backing you, tell me everything you know about them. And he's like, hey, if you want to play dumb, that's fine. He's like, I'm sure all of your men are already waiting for you in hell. But eventually we also see that Shiba goes over and frees the kid who was in there earlier, the kid who was part of that rebel group. And we see that the sorcerer, or not sorcerer, Yakuza boss is like, hey, those Shaku guys are monsters. Like, if you want to pick with fight like with monsters like that, you're insane. And Cheers like, hey, do I seem sane to you? I don't care if they're monsters. I have to cut them down. As we end the chapter of this moment, and we see that, okay, Chiro is a bloodthirsty guy who is willing to kill anyone necessary for as long as he gives people non-wielding katanas. I mean, this is a fine enough first chapter. I mean, it isn't anything special in my opinion. If anything, I really like the dynamic that's built up between Chihiro and his father in the beginning, but also I don't really like Chihiro's motive as we go on later in the chapter. And then next up is Kill Blue, chapter number 21. This chapter is titled True Experts Wing It. So, of course, last time we saw that Kazuma, of course, who was dressed up in the clothing of Kappo, had hypnotized Otogami so he couldn't shoot him. And at the beginning of this chapter, Otogami's like, oh crap, he hypnotized me. I can't believe he actually managed to do that. As he's like, I actually can't shoot him. Like, this is really bad. As he goes up and he points his gun in the air and fires it up. And he's just like, okay, well, this is good. He sort of makes a note of like, all right, I can shoot in all other directions, but it's pretty clear that I actually am hypnotized to not being able to hit you, right? And Cosmo sort of just says like, well, who's the unprofessional now? And he's just like, does anybody know where these bullets are actually going to land? Now that you fired them up in the air? As Otogami's just like, oh, hey, whatever. It's a reasonable handicap that I do this already. We then see that Otogami takes a gun and he sort of points it over to the other side of Cosmo's head and points it over to the fire hose, which is whipping around very fast and sort of makes it die down, right? As Cosmo just makes a note of like, oh, so he's gone into hiding because whenever Cosmo looked back, see the fire hose, Otogami dashed out of the way. But he sort of just makes a note of like, okay, well, hey, I hypnotized him, so I know a good way to get him out. He can't directly attack me, but it doesn't mean I'm not willing to pull some low bar tricks. As we eventually see that Cosmo just calls over to Otogami just saying like, hey, show yourself, Otogami. He's like, see for yourself what'll happen if you don't come out by the count of 3. As we see that Cosmo has hypnotized due to hold a knife up to his chin, so presumably saying that if Otogami doesn't come out, Cosmo will have this guy kill himself. So, yeah, I mean, that's a ploy that Cosmo can use for sure. There's a little joke that this guy is, like, very much of, like, a big, bad brawler type, it seems, and a little bit of a joke about defying stereotypes, but that's fine. Otogami, who is simply just hiding behind a fire truck, just walks out, and Cosmo's just like, oh, well, here we go, and now he's like, now toss your gun over to me. So Otogami does what he says and tosses over his gun over to the ground near where Cosmo is standing. And Cosmo sort of just makes it of like, oh, hey, you could throw way better than that. He's like, was it one final show of defiance? As Cosmo points over the gun at Otogami, he's like, hey, do you have any last words? But Otogami just says, hey, I mean, it's just a request, but please do me a favor. And he's like, don't kill me while wearing the face of Kappo, right? And Cosmo's like, all right, I got that, as he pulls it off and throws it off to the side, and yeah, it definitely is disguised by Cosmo. Cosmo's like, all right, hey, are you satisfied now? And he's like, all right, yeah, that's good, it means a lot. And Otogami just says like, hey, I knew it was a mask, but I still couldn't bring myself to give you a beat down while you were wearing it, right? And to Cosmo, he's just like, huh? What are you talking about? As Otogami's like, hey, you should honestly prepare yourself right now. As all of a sudden from the sky, one of the bullets comes arcing down, and it hits, on a trajectory, it hits one of the gurney carts, right? And hits the ground right over where one of the, right where, like, a bomb is or something, right? And we see Ogami's like, hey, I fired 3 shots, so at least one of them should hit. And he's like, I put a self-detonator for that capsule mini-bomb under the stretcher. As we see it, the stretcher aimed over and actually ended up hitting and clicking on to the self-bomb detonator. So as this happens, Cosmos is like, oh crap. He's like, how did you plan all this out? And as he's coming over, the explosion comes off behind him. Otogami sticks his fist out, and in the explosion, Cosmo is rocketed forward And of course, Otogami doesn't move his fist. He's just holding his fist there, so he's directly trying to attack Kazuma. As Kazuma comes in, and his face just collides with Otogami's static fist, and it's sort of this bigger deal to where Kazuma's just like, oh crap, how did you do that? He's like, damn it, this isn't happening at all. He's like, are you telling me you planned to put that bomb there from when you fired up into the sky that first time? And Otogami's was like, well, yeah, more or less. He's like, when I first fired, I knew I was aiming for the stretcher, and I sort of worked backward from there. And Kazuma's like, man, it sounds like a pretty elaborate plan in retrospect. And you just think like, man, he just winged it. Like, this is crazy. And Kazuma just continues to, like, man, what is his deal? What's going on? And he's like, he isn't just talented. He's like, his wealth of experience, the depth of his strength. This kid's in a whole nother league. But eventually Kazuma just looks up and he just says, oh, Otogami, well, you're too late. I already hypnotized Norin Mitsuoka with the command of whenever you wake up, you'll fall in love with the first person you see. As he just says, like, the odds of Inji losing to Tenma Tendo are remote at best, so in the end, all of the results will be the same. As Otogami's just like, oh crap, it's like, what the hell, please be okay, Tenma. And he's like, and Norin, please let her still be asleep. As he just sort of thinks of like the whole love triangle everybody is in, and that like Shin ends up loving, like Shin already loves Norin, and Norin is pretending to date Otogami, but then if she loves Tendo, who who he already likes Kappa, like it would be some ridiculous like triangles tree sort of deal. We then cut over to Inji and Tenma as Inji is just firing off more golf balls and golf balls that are sort of seeming to home on to Tendo, and Tenma is just swinging off soccer balls one by one, and we see that while some of them are starting to fly towards Inji, Inji sort of goes over and takes his golf club and smacks him out of the air, but we also see that he is starting to shake a little bit, and all of the explosions are going off. We sort of see that Norin is dreaming a little bit, as it seems that like she is getting ready to open her eyes. As we see Otogami is just running back towards the field where all of this is going on at. This is a really cool chapter of Kill Blue in my opinion. I really love the end of that fight, or I don't know, I forget if it's the end of the fight, but with the end of this conflict with Kazuma, right? How Otogami is just winging it, he fires those bullets up in the air and holds up his static fist, so Kazuma just flies in and gets hit by that flying punch. Like, it's just pretty cool to see, and I do honestly like Kazuma as a character, like sort of how low he's willing to go, but yeah, Otogami just looked really, really cool here. Next up is Nue's Exorcist, chapter number 18, titled Nue and Shiroha. Pretty much, we start off with a color page just showing Shiroha just sitting in her gym clothes or something and like a tree behind her. I actually do kind of like this color page, all things considered. I actually think it does look pretty cool, right? We start the chapter with Suo being interviewed by some Exorcist guys. They're sort of just interviewing her about what happened during the barbecue stuff and everything else that happened before this regarding Gakuro. And as they're sort of just doing this, there's not really too much to it. There's like a weird joke with this dude, but they just sort of interview her as she ends up walking out of where she's been being interviewed out. And outside she sees a guy, and this is Master Moro, as she calls him. This, of course, is Morioki, the dude who we saw last time, who is being sent to get rid of Shiroha. We see that Suzu's like, oh, hey, Master Moro, it's not often we see you at headquarters. But Moro's just like, hey, please stop calling me a master. He's like, I'm just dispatched instructor for the Fujino family. Like, I'm not that big of a deal. They sort of talk a little bit, but eventually Suzu's like, hey, what'd you come here for today? And Morioki's just like, hey, I actually need to talk to you, Suo. As he's like, oh, what do you need to talk to me about? But he just says, like, it is regarding your school. As apparently the two of them talk, and Suo is just like, okay, what's up with him? He always seems busy, and he looks so tired. He's like, his questions are probably were work related to. He's like, so what would someone on Master Moro's level require me to talk about, right? We cut over to the school where, of course, Shiroha has just woken up, and also Gakuro is there, and of course, the two of them were holding hands as they fell asleep last night, and Shiroha sort of smiles a little bit. She gets up and walks out and sees Nue outside, and the two of them sort of talk, and then we get just a long, drawn-out bath scene between the two of them, and, pretty much, it's just a whole bunch of talking about just goals and stuff and what's going on here. Nue eventually says, like, whatever happens, like, if you were to go back to your family, Gakuro would try to come and follow you. And Shiroha sort of makes a note of, like, hey, I'm not worth it. Like, if that happens, you have to stop Gakuro if he ever tries to come save me again. But Nue just says, like, hey, no way, I'm not going to try to stop Gakuro. And she just sort of says, like, hey, I'm happy to have met all of you, and she sort of just makes note of, like, being able to eat sukiyaki for everyone yesterday was really, really fun, as we're all just sitting there and being able to play video games, and as they eventually all come over, we see that Shiroha is just sitting there, and we see that Nue comes up to her and just gives Shiroha a really big hug, as Nue just says, like, hey, you being here makes me really, really happy. That's why I won't let you go back, not ever. As we sort of see that after this bath, they sort of cut out of it, and we see that Kyokatsu and Nue are getting ready to make breakfast for everybody, and they're all sort of sitting there talking, and Shiroha's like, hey, is there anything I can help with? But Nue's just like, no, you should probably rest. But Shiroha just gets up anyway and makes a rolled omelet for everybody. Eventually, Gakuro wakes up to Fujino, who is opening up some curtains. And she's just like, oh, hey, good morning, Gakuro. Breakfast is ready. As they all sit down and start to eat. And as Shiroha is just thinking, and she's just like, man, this just isn't good. It's like, these peaceful days cannot continue on like this. As all of a sudden, of course, as we know, there is a barrier that has been put up across the school by Nue, and all of a sudden, it just gets shattered, and Nue's is like, oh man, the barrier's been broken, huh? What's going on here? As we see that Morioki, or Master Moro as they called him, is standing outside the school, and he's just like, oh man, it's time to get to work and save all the emotions and guilt for later. And he's just like, now let's go. As we see that he's standing outside there and is apparently going down to take out Fujino and is going to have to deal with all of the people inside the school. So this chapter is fine, I guess. We get a bit more of the introduction to the next antagonist for the series, who's obviously this Mr. Moro dude, or Master Moro. Of course, we have Nue's Exorcist attempt at fan service here with a bath scene, but it's like, it's just bad, I'm going to be honest with you. And the whole point, they're just trying to talk about things that don't really matter, to the same point that we have gotten across plenty of times in this series. So, while this chapter I don't think is the worst thing I've read all week, it's definitely not like the highlight either. Like, it's sort of just there. Next up is Akane-banashi, chapter number 78. This chapter is titled A Shallow Man. As we just get some introduction, as it says, the Samente, the source from which both Rakensa and Konjakute schools arose. Along with Kashikawa, the school has been one at the foremost of Edo Rakugo since the Meiji era, boasting a total of 43 apprentices. This Samente number, it possesses the highest Museki name in inheritance in the Samente stable, the 6th Inso Samente, and as we see this, we see that Karashi is just standing here, and he's like, alright, you can stop now. As we see that, pretty much there's this big point to where, the master of Inso Samente is getting ready to be introduced for something, and Karashi's just like, alright, we can remove some of these parts because, like, this isn't a manga, you don't have to make it sound so dramatic. As long as he's introduced properly, it won't be that big of a deal, right? And we see that he's sitting there with some suit businessmen, and they're just like, well, considering this is, like, the big day, it might be nice to discuss the matter with Inso himself, right? But Karashi's just like, hey, no, we're good like this. My master Inso has left me in charge of everything aside from his actual performance, so I'm telling you what to go on now. And eventually he's just like going through and he's like, and this, having to Zinza simply recite from company history, and he's like, I don't think we should do it. But we see that somebody else just says like, no, we must. While the company president is desired for the Rakugo festivities, this is still a commemoration event of 100 years of our company's esteemed history. And we see this as a woman, and she just says, like, so it stands to reason that we should touch on this very story of the company. And Kuroshi's just like, all right, you can touch on it all you like, but we should really cut down on all the speeches here. And just like, assuming you want the crowd to pay attention, that is. Like, if there's a lot of speeches, they're not going to pay attention at all. And just like, so we'll cut in, and it'll also cut into my performance time. But eventually, this lady's like, hey, we contracted Master Inso to perform Rakugo, not any of his apprentices. And to this, Kuroshi's just like, hey, do you even know who you're talking? But before he could finish it, he's just like, no, I get it, you're right. And he sort of just walks out, just saying like, all right, that's all I have to say here. We eventually see that these two suits are sort of just getting up, and we see that the dude is just like, oh, hey, you usually don't speak like that, Minase. I mean, what's going on here, right? And, of course, Minase, who's this girl, is like, hey, I'm sorry. But she's like, the truth is, I actually know that guy. She just says, we actually went to school ever since kindergarten. And she's just like, but he would always play video games during class, but, and always joke off. But somehow his results were always better than everybody else's, as we sort of see an image of Kuroshi being number 1 into class and her being number 2 in the class. And she even starts to make a note of like, hey, he started Rakugo despite not even liking it, and somehow he was a student champion for multiple years in a row. And she's like, it gave him away with words that helped him pass every potential job interview he took, as we sort of see like he got a bunch of offers from like ABC Bank and Def TV and like some reality firm and like a realty firm and just like everything else, right? But she just makes it of like, he is just so good at everything he does. It's like truly infuriating. But she's just like, and yet, as she thinks back to like, he'll never be a pro Rakugo. She's like, the fool. And he's like, he threw away his career he had on a momentary whim, as she just thinks that like, why would he throw it all away on Rakugo? What's so big about this, right? She's like, he is a truly shallow man. As we eventually cut to the day of this 100 years of the of this company's thing or whatever, and of course the performance is getting ready to go on, as Kuroshi is picking up on the books, and he's just looking at it and he's like, man, I'd just like to hear some good old Rakugo here, right? As he's looking through it, we see that Minase here stands beside him, and she's just like, oh, hey, so you are actually going to examine the book now? But he's just like, shut up, I'm just passing the time. But eventually he's just like, hey, go away, just get out from away from me. But Minase just says like, hey, it's not going to happen. I'm going to watch from the wings to make sure you actually read it. And Kuroshi's like, all right, okay. He's like, if you don't have to, so do. You don't have to worry, so I'll do it right. As Kuroshi's like, hey, this is my job. As Kuroshi sits down and he starts to read, he says, ahem, congratulations on 100 years of your illustrious history. To commemorate this occasion, I will read from the story of the company's century of existence. As we see that he just starts to get up and talk the story of this book. As Hiro says, like, it's the 24th year of Meiji, 1891. He's like, one man is given life in the town of Shinso Hyogo Prefecture. And as he's just going through all of this, we see that Minase is just looking, and she's like, the content that he's saying is actually very accurate, but why is he reading it this way? It's not Rakugo, but somehow it's so easy to hear on the ears. As we see Kuroshi is just going through this entire book, and we see that this old man sort of comes up in a wheelchair and looks over to Minase, and she's like, oh wow, now this is quite a nice surprise we got going on here. And Minase is like, oh, hello, Mr. President, right? But he just says like, oh, well, do you see the way that that young man up there is using his fan? He's just like, and the sing-songy way he's telling that story, he's like, I remember this. This is Kodan storytelling. As we pretty much see that some more explanations, like, if Rakugo is a traditional art of conversation, then Kodan is a traditional art of reading. As we pretty much just get an idea of, like, it is an art form devoted to telling military and political exploits, And we see it, the old man of the company is just like, hey, he's both livening up the atmosphere and touching on our history. He's like, I couldn't ask for a better opening act today. I mean, it's actually quite impressive seeing it in general, right? And we see that the president just continues on saying, like ordinary Azinza in his first year would never be able to pull off so many different arts so well. But he's like, I could see why Master Enso takes him around and why he's here on a day like today when we booted out Enso. We then also see that Minase just looks up at this and she's like, man, it's really astonishing. It's like, even in Rakugo, he can just do everything he does well. And then we see later with Minase and Karashi, after Karashi's performance, Karashi sort of stand there and he hands the book back over to Minase, just saying like, hey, here, I read the book like you wanted me to, right? Just saying like, hey, do you have anything you want to say to me or what, right? But Minase just says like, oh, hey, good job up there, as she looks through the book and what he read out of, and she just thinks like, oh, he always made everything look effortless. But in reality, as she takes a look at the book, and we see that he's highlighted it and annotated a bunch of things to make it to where he could actually do a good job, right? He wasn't just sitting there and pulling shit out of his ass. He was really doing the good. He put into work, pretty much, right? And Minase just says, like, hey, why did you decide to become a Rakugoka? As Karashi just says, like, well, if I had to really give a reason, it's probably because it ain't easy. As we see this, and then we see that his master, Enso, walks up behind him, and he just says, like, and here you are saying the obvious things to know if it were some very big, profound thing. And his master just says, like, hey, are you satisfied with having performed your play-pretend version of Kodan today? And we see the two of them really get into a little bit of a banter, as eventually we see that his master just saying, like, hey, you were forbidden from being outdone in Rakugo, and Karashi's like, oh yeah, I got you. He's like, I'm like, I'd let that happen, you little old smokestack. As we eventually just see his phone, which is buzzing in the background, as we see that a few people are trying to contact him. We see one of them is Asagao, who is just saying like, oh, hey, Karashi, I want to ask you for something. And then Akane, who in his phone is known as Jugimu Girl, who is trying to contact him to say like, hey, Karashi, we have huge news. So, yeah, pretty interesting. I really like this chapter focusing more on Karashi's character, because I really do enjoy Karashi, and seeing more about him is pretty cool. Next up is Blue Box, chapter number 117. This chapter is titled A Big Step, and we got a nice little cover with Chinatsu on it in badminton attire. It's pretty cute to see. We, of course, start off this chapter with Mochizuki and Taiki's badminton match. The two of them are just going back and forth, and we see that Mochizuki starting to get a little bit unnerved as this entire battle is going on. We see that Mochizuki is thinking back to whenever Yusa was told that he was going to go to abroad, and as their team captain was just saying like, hey, this tournament doesn't matter. And he's like, this trip will actually serve you better. As Yusa's like, all right, I'll do it then. But Mochizuki's just like, oh man, if I can't win at this tournament that doesn't matter, then what about my entire position to begin with? As we see Taiki and Mochizuki just going back and forth, and we see some people who are like, oh man, what's Mochizuki doing there? As they sort of make a note of like, oh, but that guy backing down on him, I actually think that's a guy from E.M.M.I, right? As they actually don't know his name. But they're just thinking like, hey, but that guy down there, he's actually the one who's running the game right now. Like, Mochizuki actually isn't doing too good. As Taiki's just like, oh man, this guy's actually pretty strong, but if he hadn't given up on himself before, he probably could have gone even further. As we see that Taiki's just racking up the points more and more, as eventually they just go through, and Taiki lands down a smash, and Mochizuki just can't get to the ball in time, as the announcer finally calls it game. And they eventually say like, oh hey, this match goes to Inomata from E.M.M.I, and a lot of people just take note of like, oh man, I didn't know that kid was so strong, and how did Mochizuki lose, right? We eventually see the two of them go to shake hands, and after that, we cut out of the scene for a little while, as we see over abroad in some other country, we see where Yusa and all of the other Sajikawa people are sitting, right? As they say, like, oh, Mochizuki lost in the semifinals, right? And they're all like, oh, well, who's his opponent? And eventually it said that it was Taiki from E.M.M.I. And as they're just talking, like, oh, yeah, that's Haru's partner, as they just keep talking. But we see that Yusa just is sitting there thinking, like, oh, I wouldn't have lost, would I have there, right? To Taiki walking home, as we sort of skip the entire the rest of the tournament, as Taiki's walking home, he walks by a basketball court. And who would be on this basketball court but none other than Chinatsu, who's sitting there, and she pops up, is like, oh, hey, Taiki, there you are. And Taiki sort of just freaks out, like, oh, hey, what are you doing around here, right? But Chinatsu just says, like, hey, I wanted to be the first to tell you, so I waited here and figured that you'd be walking by this way. As she just says, hey, congratulations, Taiki, winning the first year tournament. And she's just like, when I got your message earlier, I was so happy. I bet all the people around me thought I was just crazy. As the two of them just sort of walk around, and Chuck's like, oh, so does that mean you won against that kid, the bowl cut? But Ty's like, no, it's a long story. He actually wasn't there. But as they just continue just walking around, Taiki just thinks, like, man, but I still can't believe I won. And he's just like, but I actually think it was all thanks to your power, Chinatsu. Is she's just like, oh, what are you talking about? And she just looks over at Taiki, and both of them are blushing really hard. As eventually, Chinatsu just says, like, oh, well, I think it's actually the same for me. As she just says, like, seeing all of your hard work, Taiki, it makes me feel so empowered. As Taiki sort of smiles then, and they're all just sitting there and talking, and yeah, it's just a little cute moment end off the chapter on the two of them just being cute with each other. Not really a whole lot more to say about that, but yeah, look at that. Taiki actually won. It's pretty cool. And the final chapter this week, of course, is Witch Watch chapter number 125. This chapter is titled The Day of the Disaster Part 12. I bet you didn't see that one coming. We started a chapter, of course, with Miharu explaining all the abilities of the Twilight Rose, and we get a little bit of a note of Jekyll just like, hey, I'm well aware of what this thing does, as we sort of just remember that he was a victim a while back. As they pretty much just talk a little bit, as Miharu pretty much says, like, yeah, it'll sap the person's strength, but it'll also restrain them, but it'll be able to kill Ran without killing Ran, right? Or incapacitate him, right? But we see he's got it in his hand, and as they are all walking by, suddenly somebody calls out to Miharu, right? As we eventually see that Nimue and Nico are just talking, as Nimue's just like, hey, I took off today from school because I woke up feeling unwell, and I was curious about what Keigo told me, so I decided to come here, and pretty much figured out everything that was going on around here. And Wolf pretty much makes it of like, oh, hey, that makes sense why you came here without any kind of plan. But Nimue's just like, well, I am sort of ashamed of that, but I did make sure to call someone before I left, right? And she's like, I didn't feel comfortable coming completely alone. As both Nico and Wolf are like, okay, well, who'd you call then? As we see the person who had called out to Miharu before, it is none other than Momochi who came here. There's a bit of a joke here where she's just like, hey, I'm finally here, as it's just a little bit of a joke that's brought up. But Miharu's just like, oh, hey, why'd you come too? Like, what's going on here? But pretty much Momochi's like, oh yeah, Nimue called me, and I was very curious and not say no to this, so I had to come here just right away. Sort of literally, as we see that she's lot skinnier than she normally is, showing that she has used a bunch of her fat from her teleportation power. Eventually, she sort of just takes Miharu down and is like, alright, Miharu, you need a good rest after your battle, but Miharu's just like, no, we can't do that, I need to go get to Morito as soon as I can. He's like, can you teleport me to him, right? But, Momochi's just like, well, where is he? And, they're all just like, well, he's close to the summit by Lover's Tree. But, oh, what's her face? Momochi's just like, well, I'm sorry, I can only teleport to places that I've personally been to before. Just like, I've never been to this park, so I actually don't think I can. But eventually she looks over to her parrot sitting on her shoulder, but she's like, actually, wait, I can. And she says her parrot, whose name is Check, is capable of being a marker for her to be able to teleport. She just has to aim for his location, so she'll just have to have the parrot Check fly over to where Morito is, right? But Miharu's like, right, that's perfect then, right? And as all this goes on, Lecter's like, all right, you can go find Morito, and the parents are like, all right, I'll be back in a bit. Miharu then just thinks like, all right, there's no guarantee this will work, we just still have to try our hardest. As eventually we cut back over to where Morito and Ran are fighting, we eventually see that Morito had just used his Kaigoku muscle gel, which is what the female orc had taught him back before. And he's just like, hey, this is a forgotten technique, but it was developed by ogres back during the Edo period. And Rand's just like, how did you learn this move? And Morito's like, hey, I told you, I'm not like you. As Rand's just like, that makes sense. You moved magic. And he just said, and Morito's like, the Ogre Masters we brought back worked me to the bone, as he goes and uses Ogre Qui-Gon movement style, Cloud Wave, to walk around. One of a few of the ninja techniques that one of the other elders taught him. And yeah, they just start fighting some more, and eventually he then uses the Bright Eyes technique that shows weak spots in people, and eventually Morito uses it, sees a weak spot near Rand's stomach, and goes and uses Kaigoku to go and punch him. And then he goes to use the final technique of Chin-In-Ga-Mu as he goes to do it, but he actually can't launch out any magic that flows through the bloodstream, right? And eventually, Rand's just like, hey, what was that weak attack? And Morito's like, god damn it, it was totally a habit from all that kata I practiced. Like, that's really my worst technique there, right? But Ron's is like, well, that brat really nailed my weak spot. She's like, it's like you can totally tell her I'm going to be vulnerable exactly, right? And Morito's just like, all right, maybe I can shake him, as he looks more on Ran and sees more of those weak spots being appeared by a Bright Eyes technique. But then Morito eventually says something very stupid, as he just says like, oh, hey, you know where I learned that move from? And he's like, your father, Moritoki Otoge, right? As Ron's just like, hey, what are you talking about? As Moi just goes up and completely just devastates Ran, beating him up a lot. And Ron's just like, what? My father? As he looks back to his past and thinks a lot more about all the things that he taught him. And Ran thinks back to whenever he was a kid, and whenever his dad taught him the Bright Eyes move too. But he's just like, I buried the memory of it since I never thought my dad actually loved me, along with all the other memories that he had of his dad. But at this point, as he gets ready to go pop up and Morito gets ready to aim another punch, we see that all of a sudden, Morito just thinks like, all right, Miharu will be here soon. I just need a Twilight and everything. It'll be perfectly fine. As Ron sort of starts to get back up, Morito looks behind him and sees a bird, and he's like, oh, is that Miharu's ribbon? As Morito just starts to fall back, as he knows what's about to happen, as he tries to lure, what's-his-face, Ron back into a position to where Momochi and Miharu have a good angle to hit him at. They start to move back, and now Ron's in a perfect position, and all of a sudden, Momochi and Miharu stand up and appear, and Miharu throws the flower perfectly at Ron, but before it hits, that's where we cut the channel, or chapter, so... Yeah, that's a pretty fun chapter of Witch Watch, as we sort of see that, yeah, Morito is using all of the powers he learned to maybe be able to be best Ron next time. I feel like I'm getting a little loopy here going through all these chapters. I've been doing this for a little while without any break, so with that, I don't really want to have too much else to say at this point, so we're going to get to all of the rankings of everything going on here. Of course, like I said, there were 12 total series this week, and personally, I thought the best chapter was Marshal Master Asumi. I thought it had a lot of awesomeness to it, sort of showing all the people in the dropout, and just showing how fast, who's his face, Nito came through and just completely bested his opponent there. Next up was My Hero Academia, and then Kill Blue, then Witch Watch, Blue Box, Akane-banashi, Kagurabachi, Undead Unluck, New Exorcist, Ichinose Family, LA Sins, One Piece, and then Mamayuyu at the very end. I definitely think that Marshal Master Asumi, My Hero Academia, Kill Blue, Witch Watch, Blue Box, and Akane-banashi were all really good chapters, just showing different parts of characters and everything they had within them. And then Kagurabachi, Undead, and Undead Unluck, I mean, I think they were fine, but they just weren't, like, amazing. And then we have Noah's Exorcist, Ichinose Family, Deadly Sins, One Piece, and Mamayuyu. Were all series that I thought were fine, but there wasn't a whole lot of good to most of them, right? I mean, One Piece, there was just a lot of convoluted stuff going on, and then Mamayuyu just didn't really work too well this week, but that's what it is. And then for my character of the week, I personally picked Stain from My Hero Academia. I really feel like Karashi would have been another great one to pick, but Stain definitely had it by far, and he just had an awesome moment of appearing out of nowhere and letting All Might be able to get an attack on All for One next chapter. With that, I am very tired of speaking, and I don't have too much more else to say. I've got a Discord and a Twitter account linked down below. You can go check those out if you feel like supporting a channel in any way. And if you want to talk about any of these series, come join those two communities there. And leave a comment down on the video if you got anything cool to say. But I got nothing else to say. This will be Glowplasma231 out.